Welcome to Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, a new Procurious podcast series. Hi there, I'm Philip Eidson, the host of Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, a 5-part procurement podcast series sponsored by IBM. And there's many factors that require careful consideration to bring about effective cognitive solutions. It's really akin to conducting a group of musicians. It may be possible, even easy, to attain a pleasant sound from a solo instrument. But when expertly managed, you can accomplish a symphony from an entire orchestra. And this week, Procurious and IBM are taking you through the 5 steps to conducting a dazzling cognitive symphony, from building your orchestra to getting the brass on board and orchestrating your melody. On day 1, building your orchestra, I'm joined by Marco Romano, Procurement Chief Analytics Officer at IBM. And I started by asking Marco if he could set the scene for the series and explain what he means by the term cognitive and analytic strategies.
Well, that's a great question, and one that, frankly, I could talk for hours. And the reason I say that, simply put, is this. To me, the cognitive and analytic strategy really starts, actually, with the data strategy. That is to say, how we acquire, enrich, store, and curate our data.
Yeah.
Then it really, becomes about what you do to that data to bring business value and actionable insights, including what you do to change and drive behaviors resulting from those insights. That is the purpose of the white paper, really, is to highlight that a good strategy in this space is not just about the cognitive and analytics tools as it's often understood, but really must span, that full life cycle of data as well as the specific tools, people, and change management.
Yeah. So what's the end goal then, as we think about why listeners and procurement leaders should care about it? What's the art of the possible? Because that may give them a perspective on what to work towards.
Yeah, so, it has to be about creating actionable business insights, that enhance the practitioner's ability exponentially, either really by helping them to get to the end goal faster or giving them visibility, to trends, prediction, scenario analysis that would otherwise be impossible, purely because of, the sheer volumes of data, the complexity, right, of the environment that we're working in. As to what's possible, I'd argue anything is possible, quite honestly, limited only by our imagination and one very important point, which is, the quality and quantity of the data that's available to us.
You talk about, throughout the series on the podcast, also in the white paper, you use the analogy of an orchestra. I just wonder if you could explain why you think that, that's such a powerful metaphor when it comes to cognitive and analytic strategies.
Yeah, sure. I love this analogy, right? So even for a non-orchestra or opera lover, if you've had the opportunity to sit and listen to an orchestra performance, right? When you sit there at the start of the performance, invariably you're hearing these individual members tuning the instruments, warming up.
Right.
And, it's very melodic and you kind of really get to hear, the class of the instrument and the performer. But it's really when that conductor walks on stage and all of those instruments are played together in harmony, that's when it really becomes incredible. That's when the goosebumps come in and you hear the power of the sound. Now if you translate that to data and insights, right? One good piece of data, absolutely valuable and can really help you make better business decisions. But like an orchestra, a collection of this transformed data, properly orchestrated to provide, these varied and powerful insights at the right time, of course, and in the right format for the intended audience, really gives you that competitive advantage and operational efficiency. So it requires that coordination, and to coin a cliche, right, it really needs everyone, playing from the same sheet of music or the same hymn sheet. And that's why it's such a simple but great analogy.
You mentioned as really the foundation is obviously the acquisition of data. what kind of data should we be seeking to acquire? Because I think we often think about this in a one-dimensional way, that maybe there's one or two sources of data and we just try and make what we can of that data. But to use the analogy of an orchestra, it sounds like it's data that's coming from lots of different places. Where should we be looking for this?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is data coming from a lot of places, but I think before you even answer the question of what the data is that you need, you really need to address the question of why you need it.
Yeah.
What is the business outcome that you're trying to drive? What is it that you want to achieve by acquiring this data? Then I think you can start to determine what data you need, how you go about it, acquiring it and enriching it. I've seen an awful lot of effort go into acquiring data that never resulted in a business action.
Interesting.
Not because it was bad data, but it was just not fit for purpose.
Yeah.
So, in our case, we use transactional data such as POs, invoices, quotes, of course. RFP information, extremely powerful. But then you can extend that to market intelligence that's either acquired or researched. We use market sentiment, client and customer demand. So you can see really it's a real broad base.
Yeah.
I think the importance here is that it's fit for purpose at the time that it's needed and, of course, for the intended recipient.
So what are some of the things that you do to determine if a data source or a potential data source is fit for purpose before you go down the road of actually trying to acquire and cleanse and build it into your models?
Yeah, so we really start with a couple of things. The first one is, as I said, what is the intended outcome, business outcome that you want? And kind of we almost do a bit of a regression analysis to find a better way of saying it, that says, so, here's the outcome, as a practitioner, what are the elements of information that I use, right, as an individual to make business decisions? And that in turn leads us back to, of course, the data. There is a point, Philip, which we of course have to consider, and that's ROI. Yeah. We can't afford to throw money or resources after poorly invested activities, right? And some of the data is extremely difficult to come by, or extremely difficult to get to the level of quality that we need. So, I think you need to have clear line of sight of how these insights are going to allow you to change business course or alter business strategy and effect an outcome. Then you can start to also establish to what degree this data will help you achieve that. So, how much impact is that data going to have? And then in turn, you can start to then make sensible decisions about ROI and the type of data that you need.
That makes sense. I think when we gather data, a lot of it is based on other people, like or areas outside of procurement. I'm thinking of, the way that an invoice is keyed, for example, or maybe the way that a supplier completes a cost breakdown. It's things that we're not necessarily always in control of, but it has such an impact on the usability of the data that that comes down the pipe. I wonder if there's something that procurement leaders or guidance you could give procurement leaders on how they could develop a strategy and execute that strategy to ensure there's a consistent acquisition of data.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Huge dependency on others to provide data, and that's what makes it such a challenge. To address this, I think the strategy really has to be multidimensional. And some of the elements, we're going to cover in subsequent podcasts. Yeah. But I believe it starts really with the procurement category strategies. Data acquisition and data quality, I believe, has to be built into the sourcing strategies rather than an afterthought. Yeah. Typically practitioners really focus on, of course, their primary role, right, which is, how am I going to put a competitive contract in place with the right suppliers? But I think increasingly, the data and how they acquire the data through that process needs to be a factor. How do these categories engage the market? What pricing schedules they use, rate cards, taxonomies, and so on. So I really do believe you need to establish these business stakeholders as owners of information and align data quality with business measures. These strategies, of course, then need to be supported by the right systems and tools to support data acquisition in an automated and efficient manner. And ultimately, you do need to have the ability to transform data because, to your point, there are just too many moving cogs, and it's unlikely that we're ever going to receive data in the perfect way.
Right.
Now, having said that, we don't all want to become experts at transforming data and developing tools, especially when that's not our core competency of our business. So I think part of the data and analytics strategy also needs to be a consideration of the right partners who can close that data acquisition and transformation gap for you.
Yeah, I think one thing that really stood out that you said there was from a category management perspective, it's being proactive in understanding the data that you want to see and maybe then figuring out how to go and get that, as opposed to being reactive, which I know from my experience, I often is here's the data that's available, how do I best use it? And it's a little bit of a mindset shift, isn't it, to think about what's possible rather than, well, this is the only information I've got, and it's not really going to give me much insight, so then I need to ignore it and find some other information or some other data.
Yeah, absolutely. The category managers, I think, have such a significant role to play here in transforming the data and transforming that process and engaging with that outside world. As you rightly said, we're so dependent on the outside world, but we really do find, significant successes by engaging, those suppliers through the category management team and influencing, how we acquire data. And Flip, one of the things, I often get asked is, so do you want to go and force all your suppliers and everybody to comply to, your data standards? And no, that's not the point. But, what we do want to do is we do want to have data, sent to us in a way that we can, get to it, that we can read it, transform it. So it's really not a case of forcing everyone. It's rather a case of making sure it's accessible and something that we can transform.
So I have a final question, and that's from a practical perspective. What are some of the actions that you've seen companies who have built this foundation do that you would consider to be really good practices?
Yeah, you need leadership commitment first and foremost. That means you need to understand and articulate why data quality and governance is critical to the analytics and cognitive journey for your organization. Second to that, and obviously very much a part of that, is define measurable outcomes that you will, be able to go and gain that support from senior leadership level and draw the required level of investment, of course, because that, critical component to getting this achieved. I do think you need a formal project rather than, letting it happen by sort of osmosis. I think you need a defined action and project. And I'll add one further thing to that. As the project is a knowledge project with, lots of unknowns and learnings that need to happen along the way, I would strongly recommend adopting, agile principles and practices, as that really works well with this type of activity and lends itself to that concept of, iterative trial, quick course correction, and also, quick results back to the business.
Thanks for listening to Day 1 of Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, sponsored by IBM. Head on over to Precurious.com for additional content on our blog and to contribute questions or comments via our discussion board. And you can also download Marco Romano's white paper, What are the Success Factors in Cognitive and Analytic Strategies and Adoption, via IBM.com.